And welcome to episode number 112 of the Showrunner. I'm your host, Jared Morris. I'm here with my co-host, Johnny Naster, the host of Hack the Entrepreneur. And we are excited for another week of talking about creating better shows, creating better podcasts with you. Johnny is here wearing a t-shirt that says propaganda, but I assure you this is a propaganda-free zone here on the Showrunner. Just all truth and stories from experience about how to create better shows. Right, Johnny?
Right. It says Propagandy.
Oh, it does? Propagandy.
It's a Canadian rock band.
Very nice.
Just
always
so
with the
we know.
t-shirts. And by the way, if you want to see what t-shirts Johnny is wearing, we have started recording these live and broadcasting it on YouTube. This one, we actually posted it in the Facebook group for the Showrunner course members. So we'll see if anybody trickles over live, but we'll start announcing these a little bit more, putting them out there publicly so that if you want to come join us for some of these live recordings, we can do some of that. Johnny, I want to talk today about interviews, if that is cool with you.
Yes.
You've done a few, I think, in your
12.
12,000 maybe.
Yesterday.
Yeah. You've done a lot of interviews. So I had a really cool experience this week. Sunday night, I think it was Sunday night, I watched a movie on ESPN. It was actually on ESPN Plus. They have a new streaming service, and it's called Last Days of Night. Are you, by chance, aware of this film?
No.
I didn't think so. It's about basketball. It's about college basketball. Have you ever heard of Bob Knight? Maybe I should ask that. Okay, so you haven't heard of Bob Knight.
I'm shaking my head. This is for people who are watching us live.
Yeah. Okay, so Bob Knight is a basketball coach here in the United States. He coached at my beloved Indiana University. Coached there for 29 years, won 3 national championships. He's renowned as one of the greatest basketball coaches of all time. Also, a fascinating figure because he has a ridiculous temper, was fired from his job in part because he put his hands around the neck of a player, would do things like come out of a bathroom with his pants around his ankles and holding toilet paper, telling the players this is how they were playing. So he's a very, let's just say, interesting guy. And so this documentary was all about what led up to his firing. And it was really interesting for me because I was actually on campus at the time that he was fired, gave a speech on the steps of the arena, in support of him. 15 years later, however many years later it is now, I certainly feel a lot differently about him than I did then. But anyway, watch this documentary. It was really good. It was eye-opening. And the next day I was, planning what podcast we were going to do for that week with my co-host on Podcast on the Brink. And so what if we try to interview, the filmmaker of this, who also happened to be the journalist that uncovered the tape of him putting his hands around the neck of the player that eventually led to his firing. And the documentary kind of shows that journey that he took reporting the original story. And it was really well done, really interesting. And so we talked with the publicist for the show. She got us in touch with him. And the next day we had an interview with him. So, about a 36-hour turnaround from watching this film to now, which, again, dealt with a very kind of personal experience for me. And now we have him, for 30, 45 minutes to ask him questions. So that's kind of the setup here. And before we get into some of the interview part of it, how cool is that? Like, it's one of the side benefits of hosting a podcast that you can do that. Because if I had just been like, hey, I'm Jared Morris, I'd love to, talk with Robert on the phone with questions about this, they probably would have told me to buzz off. But Jared Morris, host of Podcast on the Brink, we'd love to have Robert on to talk about the film and promote the film. Now you're getting somewhere, right? So it never ceases to amaze me the kinds of doors it can open when you have a powerful podcast behind you, or even just a podcast behind you, because people want to come on, talk about their stuff, promote their stuff. So I just want to take a moment here to pause and reflect on one of the many benefits of doing what we do.
Absolutely. So just to tie it into something, I was part of a conversation yesterday. I was interviewing somebody who has been publishing. He's publishing books now and records, but he published what are called zines. So from the 90s, early 2000s, zines were like a real thing, especially in punk rock. It was a way you kind of got stuff out. It was like blogs before blogs. People would write them, they get distributed around. And there was this guy who started one, a zine, and then built it into this business. He's exactly my age, and he started in 1996. So 22 years he's been doing it. I got to talk to him yesterday. And his thing, I was like, why did you start like publishing a zine? It's like, I don't know if I should say this, but I actually only started so that I could talk to people that I wanted to really talk to and I looked up to. And I knew that they wouldn't talk to me unless I was interviewing them for a zine. I was like, wow, I've said that exact same thing about podcasting.
Yeah.
Podcasting is apparently the new zine.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. So anyway, so we do this interview with him. I spent obviously a lot of time preparing for it. We do this interview. It went really, really well. It was a great conversation, and he sent me a text after the interview was over, and the text said, "Kudos to you guys. You asked the best and most thoughtful questions of any people I've spoken to yet. Sadly, 40 to 50% of the radio interviewers who are asking me questions haven't seen the film yet. Thanks for taking pride in your work and taking the time to watch the film and think about it." And getting that text message really meant a lot to me because we had put in a lot of time preparing, even though it was a quick turnaround. We cared about the subject. We wanted it to be a good interview. We put a lot of time into kind of crafting these questions, and it kind of made me reflect back on what were the parts of that preparation that were really important, because that's obviously something that I want to do the next time. And so I thought that for this episode, we could walk through some of the things, again, as I reflected on this experience, and then just other stuff that you and I have learned over the years for how to craft thoughtful interview questions. Because obviously when you do an interview like that, you want to get positive response from the audience. And we have, I've had a lot of people also who have emailed me to say that they really thought the interview was well done. They appreciated the questions, that we asked the kind of questions they would have wanted us to ask, which is, to me, the number one compliment that you can get after you do an interview from your audience. And the number two compliment is from the person that you're interviewing, thanking you for asking you thoughtful questions. And so I thought that we could spend some time going into what it takes, what it requires to craft the kind of questions that are going to get those kinds of responses from your audiences and from the people that you're interviewing. If you're down with that.
Let's do it. We have a lot of really good content here to cover, so we should get into it. And
maybe we should start here, which is drawing a distinction between one-off interviews, which this was. There's no template here. It's not like we had done a bunch of interviews with these documentary filmmakers, and so we had kind of a standard set of questions that we walked them through. This was a one-off interview about an individual subject with an individual guy, so everything was going to be crafted uniquely. Draw a distinction between that and something like Hack the Entrepreneur, where you're working with a question template and kind of trying to tease out insight along the same lines about a similar topic with the people as they come through your interview. We don't do that on Podcast on the Brink because we're interviewing different people in different contexts. And so, do you think there's a big distinction there? Do you think it's important to draw that distinction? Because it's not that you don't customize your interview for the person and don't kind of go with the flow as you're going into it. But I think it's a little bit different when you have a question template like that you're starting from, doing that episode after episode.
Absolutely. When you're doing the one-off, to me, I visualize it as like multiple sets of variables. So there's sort of what you're trying to get out of the interview. Then there's going to be your questions, which are another complete variable. And then there's a different guest every time. So another variable. With my sort of thing, there's only one real variable. Like as a default, of course, I do follow-up questions, I engage, and I do that. That has to be done to make a good interview. But to me, the way I visualize it is the only variable in my interviews is the guest. So that's kind of how, Hack the Entrepreneur is sort of based around. It's you, the entrepreneur. So I'm going to ask the same questions about the same to kind of glean the same insights, but you are the variable. So therefore, it can be completely different than what the last person said, and it should, because you're such a huge variable in that situation, but it's only the one variable. So the questions, the outcomes stay the same all the time, and there's still a variable to keep it interesting. But in the other sense, I see all three sections as variable within it.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about that. We've done many episodes in the past about interviews, and so I'll link to those in the show notes, and you walk through some of that process there. But as I was planning this episode, I was really gearing it more towards kind of those one-off interviews. And so with that said, I've got three kind of main areas that I want to hit here. And so let's jump into number one, which is you got to do your homework. I don't think, if you want to craft thoughtful interview questions, I mean, I suppose that you can hope to get lucky that you're just going to like make up these questions that are really thoughtful. But I think you're going to have to do homework. You're going to have to put in a little bit of time. You're going to have to say, you know what, this interview is worth getting right. I'm going to put in an hour or a couple of hours or however long it takes to read the materials, watch the materials, listen to the materials that I need to consume, and then spend some time, crafting some questions. Because if you're doing a 25 or 30-minute interview, you are not going, and that's, I think, what most interviews are. Most of us aren't doing 2, 3, 4-hour interviews where you can do some of that through the course of the conversation. If you're doing a 25, 30-minute interview, you're not going to be able to get really deep below the surface unless you've done some homework. Now, in this case, we watched the film, which was the main homework that we needed to do, and then had the idea to book him for the interview. So it's not like, okay, we found this guest, now we have to go do the homework because we know we're interviewing the person. This went, we consume material. It was really interesting. Let's interview this guy. So we had done part of the homework going into it. But if it's the other way, you've still got to do the homework if you really want to craft thoughtful interview questions. And there's no way that we would have been able to engage him. His name is Robert Abbott. If we didn't have intimate knowledge of the film, along with the historical context of, kind of what happened and an understanding of our audience. When I talk about homework, it might be more than just reading the book. You might need to do a little bit of homework about your audience too, to understand what they know about this. What is their prior knowledge to this? So again, you got to watch the film. You've got to read the book, or at least skim it, or read excerpts, or read reviews. You got to listen to that podcast, read the blog. At a minimum, at an absolute minimum, you've got to have a taste for what your guest is producing. And if there's a specific item that you're going to be talking about, or that that they're going to want to promote that is going to be the subject of this, then you need to have an intimate knowledge of that thing. And the mindset I think that you have to have is you are the leader of a conversational journey and you're the advocate for your audience. And that is a kind of dual role that is going to require effort to pull off well, because you can't just go into this, and we'll get into this a little bit more in number 2, but you can't just go into this, wanting to have the conversation that you think is interesting with the person. It's got to be the conversation that will be interesting to the audience. Now, if you've identified strongly with your audience, then a lot of times those things will overlap, but don't take for granted that they will. And so all that comes back to me to doing your homework, because the only way that you're going to really be able to probe beneath the surface and tease out of your guest something more than maybe what they've already given, or certainly something that's compelling for the audience to listen to, is if you've done your homework so that you know what the interesting topics to address will be and what the best questions will be to ask.
Well said.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, knowing the person, having watched the film, sort of thing. This goes back sort of to what we talked about in the intro, which is interviewing, the power of podcasting to get to interview who you want to interview. Like just the idea, like when I use a product or a service or an app or something, and I'm just like, this is cool. It's amazing that I can just be like, oh, who made this? Email them and like get them on the show in 2 weeks. That's really cool. And it also then does give you that context for this, because you have wanted to have this person on the show. And so you probably know something about them, and therefore it does sort of make it, I guess, possible. But the idea of the excerpts, I've found that people are starting to do, actually I've only had 2, but they're starting to like create sort of a document with sort of excerpts from their book and sort of highlights and things to help you frame an interview in different ways if you want, which I think is super, super clever, because it's helpful to the host, and it's obviously for you on the other, if you're being interviewed, it's also good for you if the host knows what they're doing, and so giving them that framework. But if you don't get that, which we typically don't, you have to kind of make that framework yourself to work with you.
Yeah, and it's important to note here, like this homework can't go on endlessly. You might not have 2 weeks to prepare for a single interview. I mean, you may need to try and do this in the couple of hours that you have, or the 30 minutes that you have, or whatever. We all have different situations, and we only have so much time maybe that we can prepare for an individual interview. But you got to do as much homework as you can. And I think, the more homework that you put in, the better you're going to be able to craft really good questions. So just remember that, and don't take shortcuts, or at least be realistic with what you're going to be able to produce if you can only put in so much time, or you're only willing to put in so much time. But I think that is, to me, absolutely the first place to start if you want to craft thoughtful interview questions. The next place to go, this is number 2 here, is you've got to have a defined purpose, a defined angle, a defined perspective going in. And what I mean by that is not necessarily like something that you have to get out of the guest, or like an agenda that you're trying to, to use this guest to further. That's not what I mean. But I think what you have to understand is, who is this for, and what do you want them to get out of it? And this is where it goes back to your audience. So I think we've always got to be thinking of ourselves as that advocate for our audience as we're preparing for the interview. So the first thing that you've got to know is, where is your audience coming to this interview from? So are you assuming that your audience will have, read the book or watched the film or listened to the podcast ahead of time? Because if so, if that's your assumption, that you're doing this for people who have already consumed this content, then I think you're going to want to work on pulling additional insight out, so that it isn't just the guest regurgitating what your audience has already seen. Not that that can't be valuable or can't be useful, but I think if you can go that extra level, talk about maybe the stuff that was not said, get into some of the subtext or some of that, those things. Now you can really add some extra layers of insight. But if not, and it's totally fair, if you're interviewing a guest, it's a brand new book, you don't think the audience has read the book, then it's okay to extract as much insight as the guest will give, about the book. But remember that they may not want to give it all away. So you may have to understand that from the guest perspective, but you're still going to have to prepare to understand what that book is, what it's about, what this guest is bringing that is going to be interesting for you to pull out of the audience. But I think it's really important to understand where the audience comes from, because if you know that they're already going to have consumed this content, you can take a little bit of a different track in how you're crafting your questions to try and probe a little bit deeper. Yep. Okay.
True, man. I'm trying to, it's hard when I guess if it's like a new book, especially, it is interesting sometimes to think of what the outcome of the book is intended to be by the author. Like, what sort of transformation are they trying to make in the audience there? And then if you can kind of set the interview up at the beginning, with sort of teasing out that transformation, and then the people who are really targeted by this book will be piqued. Their interest will be piqued, and they'll want to listen to it. And it kind of then allows you to take it from a high point, like, here's the big finale, and then let's go through it, and you'll pay more attention to it as it goes. There's such a, I tend to think of it sort of like a story arc when you're doing an interview. No matter how basic the interview is, you have to, like, it can't just be all out super intense questions or all out just really boring questions. You have to kind of ride it, because one thing on the other end of it, doing the interview, it's hard on the guest, but it's also hard on a listener. And so you kind of do need to have that so it can flow. But starting in that way, especially if none of us have read this book, and sort of setting the stage of what the point of it is, I think is really good, because it does draw us. It's like start of a TV show, and they kind of show you the best highlights, and then goes to an intro, and now let's go in, because that way it's like, oh my God, I want to know how that happened. That to me works, right? This is show running. So that's how I tend to think about it.
Yeah, it's a good point. So the second part of this, in terms of having a defined purpose or angular perspective going in, is I think you've got to find the intersection between what seems interesting to know and then what is the unique insight that this guest can provide. So let's take the first part of that, which is what seems interesting to know. This is a question that you need to ask yourself. And that probably seems obvious, but I feel like it's still worth stating, because it's not just, okay, you think about this question, your very first reaction, what seems interesting to know? I would chew on this question a little bit, because there are going to be multiple layers of what seems interesting to know. And the nice thing is, if you have a strong identifying connection with your audience, and I mentioned this earlier, then you should be able to trust your gut on the subjects or the questions that you find most compelling, that your audience will probably find them compelling as well. And that's good. You want to have that connection. And the more interviews that you do with your audience and the more that feedback loop is open and the more you identify with them, the easier that will be. But I also think, why not just ask your audience as well? And we've done this a number of times. And I never cease to be amazed by the kind of insightful questions that the audience comes up with. So as you're thinking about what seems interesting to know, ask your audience what they think is interesting to know. For this very interview, I got a lot of good question ideas from putting a message in the forum over at Inside the Hall, and that's who we do the podcast for, and asking those folks, hey, we're getting ready to interview Robert Abbott. We watched The Last Days of Night. What questions would you like us to ask? And look, some of the questions, I didn't think were the greatest of questions. Others were really good. And I either kind of compiled them into one question or a couple questions I just lifted verbatim to ask them because they were really good questions. And it was a little bit of a different take than I was thinking, but I actually thought the way that they worded it and the kind of the specific insight they were getting at was better than the angle I was thinking about taking. So what seems interesting to know to you? And then don't hesitate to ask your audience. And then once you get that, once you kind of have this, this list of things that seem interesting to know, you're probably not going to hit all of them. So now what you want to think to narrow it down and zero in your focus and make sure that you get the best questions from maybe that initial list that you write out is, what is the unique insight that this guest can provide? Because you've got them for a finite period of time and you want to maximize that amount of time. So what are they going to be best suited to answer? So, and I'll give you an example of this from this very interview. So one of the questions that I had written down to ask Mr. Abbott was about, the specifics won't matter to you, but I'm just going to use them for, for illustrative sake. I was going to ask him whether he thought Indiana would have still made the Final Four in 2002 had Bob Knight still been the coach. He was fired, 2 years earlier. I didn't ask this question because I had it written down on my sheet, but, as we got into the interview and, he's giving us insight on certain things, I thought, he doesn't really have particular insight on this question. That all happened beyond when he was reporting the story. It would have just been asking him to speculate about something. And the answer might have been okay, but there were other angles that he would have been more uniquely suited to provide insight on. So, let's prioritize questions the right way. So I left that one off. Now, it's not just that speculation is wrong, though, because one of the questions I did ask him was to speculate about this player, Neil Reed, who was kind of the tragic figure in this story. I asked him, whether Neil would have wanted the story told again. And this is a place where his speculation really was interesting because he had this really close, unique relationship with Neil. He actually told us how, he was on the phone with him for 9 months, about once every week. And they built this relationship before he ever reported a thing, which is a crazy amount of work and patience to put in for a journalist. But as he said, sometimes you've got to build these relationships before people trust you enough with their story. And so that relationship he had made it interesting to know, because Neil Reed passed away several years ago, whether he thought he would have wanted this story retold, because he would have had to relive, some of this traumatic stuff that he went through. And so his unique insight made that speculation interesting, whereas the other one, it just wouldn't have been as interesting. And so you've got to understand the unique insight of your guest. This gets back to the homework, and then be willing to, again, take that list of what seems interesting to know, pair it with your understanding of the unique insight of the guest, and that will allow you to prioritize your questions so you know which stuff you absolutely have to get to and which stuff might just be nice to ask at the end if you have a little bit of extra time. But that ability to prioritize is so important to make sure that you get the best questions asked during the time that you have allotted.
So just to further sort of understand this unique insight that the guests can bring, in your example, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm absolutely baffled by the basketball analogy of it. But he spent 9 months on talking to this guy beforehand on the phone once a week or something. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, is it not so much his unique insight, but his unique place and information and subject matter? He was the only one who's done that.
Yeah, he was the only one who could have really provided an answer to that question. Like beyond probably Neil's wife, he was the only other person who could answer that. And it was interesting because his answer was probably not, you know, and that's an interesting answer for a guy who clearly valued the contribution Neil made to the story, you know, to still produce this. You know, to say probably not that he wouldn't have wanted to relive it. It was probably the most compelling part of the interview. And so it would have been a real shame if we hadn't gotten to that because, you know, we asked another question that, you know, any thousands of Indiana fans probably have an opinion on and have some unique insight to add to it. To your point, he was probably one of two people on earth who could have answered this with some level of authority. And that made it really interesting. And if you've only got a guess for a finite amount of time, to me, those are the questions that you want to ask because this is, and especially if you set the interview up the right way, this is the stuff your audience is going to want to know.
Right. Okay, I see.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the second part. So we've talked about doing your homework. We've talked about having a defined kind of purpose or angle or perspective going in and understanding how to combine, you know, and prioritize from what seems interesting to what your guest's unique insight is. And then for number 3, and Johnny, I think you're really going to agree with and identify with this section, and a lot of this I credit to you because I've learned it from you, is the importance of being prepared but also being flexible. So what I think is important here, and some people may disagree with this, but I think it's important to write out your questions. I actually try to write them out as I would say them. So if for some reason I just absolutely have to read the question because I'm flustered or whatever, I've got it there. But do this how it works for you. Again, I type them out. You know, maybe you just want to put bullet points or you want to list topics and you're totally fine. You trust yourself in the moment to be able to say the question. You know, I don't usually end up reading the questions word for word, but the act of crafting the question, and I do think it's more crafting than just writing because I often rewrite them and rearrange, you know, how I think it should be asked. It solidifies it in my mind so I'm prepared to deliver it naturally in the moment. It also allows me to go through the process of thinking about the setup I need for that question. And whereas in the moment I might ramble and it takes me 90 seconds to say the question, I can say, okay, you know what? I don't really need this little part of it. Let me get this out of there. And it helps me create a tighter question, that process. And that's why the word crafting is in the headline of this, you know, in the title of this episode, because it really is crafting. And, you know, look, this process helps me learn the different questions that I have. So I know what's in my arsenal before the interview starts. You know, I know, okay, I've still got, you know, these other 3 questions down here coming. I'm about to ask this question, you know, and you can kind of prioritize in the moment based on what's been said, you know, what your guest has revealed that maybe you weren't expecting, this different path that you could go on. You got to know all these questions, have an understanding for how they fit together, but then the ability to be flexible once you actually get in the moment so that it's the best conversation that's possible.
Absolutely.
The second, yeah, here, jump in
quickly. Because you're right. I absolutely 100% agree with questions being written out, being easy for you to access and seeing. I do this for 2 reasons, or I suggest this especially to other people to do for 2 reasons. One is so obviously you know the questions, but the other one is there's this other side, especially when you're starting out, of having those questions in front of you really can give you the confidence that if your guest just stops talking right now, because sometimes they just get kind of flustered or something and they think they're talking too much and they just stop. Now you have somewhere to go. It's not where you're just going to get caught off guard. And even if that might not happen, I know that it personally, it sits in the back of my head, or did when I started. And so this really made me just be able to relax and become sort of a part of the conversation. And then just if you when you are writing out questions, because you should, it's you're staring at a blank page, and that's always hard right now, but just think of these 3 words are how questions should be started, which is what, how, and why. Those 3 types of questions, what, how, and why, they kind of make it necessary for your guest to tell a story or explain something in more detail. There's no really way you can answer a question, what, how, or why, with a yes or no. it just doesn't work. And so when you start asking those questions that can be asked in that way, you will get guests who will answer in that direction. So think what, how, why. It's a classic sort of interviewing strategy. Those are the best questions, and they're the best questions because it really helps your guest shine and be able to give really good answers.
So, for example, instead of asking Robert Abbott, do you think Neil Reed would have wanted this story retold? Which he could answer yes or no. Say maybe, how do you think the conversation would have gone with Neil if you had told him that you were creating this documentary and going to be, reliving this?
Exactly. Otherwise, if you say "do you," then it's like yes or no, and they almost have to be really confident that you wanted to hear a story, but you didn't ask for it, or like their real opinion on it.
Yeah.
Just ask me a yes or no question. So if I say yes because, and then go into a 5-minute reason, which is what you want because it's interesting, but they're kind of like the whole time might be thinking like, does he just want me to shut up because he just asked me a yes or no question?
Yeah.
Those are the things that make for not a stellar interview. And so reframing it just in that way, which any question you want to ask can be framed under what, how, or why. It's just sort of reworking it to think of the outcome you want.
It's too bad we didn't do this episode before the interview. Fortunately, we got a good story out of it. But you're
totally
really right.
Well. Obviously, you can still do really well. This is just,
yeah. Okay. So the second part of being prepared but flexible is knowing how you want to begin, having, I think, a pretty good idea of where you want to end, but then obviously not being rigid in the middle, letting the conversation flow. So not just having like 10 questions and we're going to go in order and boom, boom, boom. Look, as you mentioned, Johnny, especially if you're starting out and you're not that comfortable and you've got that list of questions and you just want to follow it through as you're building your confidence, that is fine. That's not going to just like ruin it. But we're talking a little bit next level with this episode. How do you make an interview just okay to good or to great? And I think that's going to require some ability to read the moment and be in the moment and go with the conversation as it goes. And, I think no matter what, no matter where you are in your show running or in your interview experience, I think knowing where you want to begin is good. What's your first question? Because I guess unless you just have something crazy happen in like the 5 or 10 minutes of ice breaking that you're doing before you start recording, you're probably going to be able to come up with a pretty good place for where you want to begin. So understand what that first question is. So you always begin in a very confident way, in a specific direction. And I think it's okay to have an idea of where you want it to end and maybe even a final question that probably 80 to 85% of the time that you will get to. But then again, being really flexible in the middle. So, because the thing to remember about being flexible in the middle is you may have this one question and you may have guests, and we've all had these guests that they have long, expansive answers. And so they might actually answer one of your questions in a different one, right? Or they might open a door to a follow-up. Well, if there's a great opportunity for a follow-up, you've got to take it. You can't just be, kind of a slave to that list of questions that you have. And at the same time, if question number 6, if they answered that already in question number 2, you may lose the guest and you may lose your audience if you ask that again, because your guest may think, wait, was he listening when I, said this before? And your audience may think, all right, we already heard this, let's get past this. So that's why that flexibility in the middle is so important, but you can still kind of bookend it with some preparation and understanding of how you want to begin and end. But just make sure that you're flexible in the middle.
Yeah. And I'm just going to please ask that you don't start your interview by asking them to tell you a little bit about themselves. Until the day when I just don't hear about that happening anymore. But
I hate that.
And this isn't just me. I feel 100% validated and confident in this, Jared, because I belong to a subreddit. It's about podcasts. So it's not about podcasting. It's about podcasts and people just obsessed with listening to podcasts. And somebody just posted a question over the weekend, which is like, what's the one thing you hate so much and makes you turn off a podcast? And so many people were like, why do they ask, tell me a little bit about yourself, especially when they just did a 10-minute intro telling me about the person?
Yes.
Or that's the only reason why I'm listening to this episode is because I love this person. It's like, I know. And I was like, that's awesome. As a podcaster, I feel like that is it's a lazy way to start. It's almost like you didn't do your research, and
Yep.
it's your guest up to just be like, oh, here we go again. But to hear it from the listener side who knows nothing about podcasting itself really, really hit it home for me. It's not me as me trying to craft good interviews. As the listener, which is what I thought it was for, it actually is, because that's one of the biggest complaints by podcast listeners. So.
Yes. Also, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And also, if you only have 25 or 30 minutes with the person and you ask them to explain their background and they go on for 5 minutes, you just lost 16% or 20% of your total time talking with them. And they, because I've been on podcasts and people ask me that, and I don't know how much to go into it. Like, how much is too much? What do they want? Am I supposed to do a quick 30 seconds or 5 minutes? And so you put your guest in kind of an awkward position where they're talking about themselves with not real clear parameters, probably. And it's awkward. It's not good audio. Yes. Thank you for bringing up that point, because it's a great one. All right. And the third element here of being prepared but being flexible is, and now that I'm thinking about this really doesn't fall into crafting thoughtful interview questions, but it does fall into how many of your questions you'll be able to get to and, kind of planning out the interview. But it's really important to be clear with your guest about how long you plan to keep them, and then use your best judgment on how to be or on how strict to be with it. And I want to get your thoughts on this, Johnny, because, so for instance, with this interview with Robert Abbott, we said at the beginning, I asked him, are you good for about 30 minutes? Because that's about what we're planning. He's like, yeah, that's fine. But as we got to like the 25th minute and the 26th minute, like I kind of got that feeling that he was really into the conversation and not all that concerned about the time. So I asked a few questions at the end, and it took it to about 36 minutes. And I felt a little bad about it. But again, I got every indication from him that he was cool with it. The questions were engaged. It's not like he was starting to give me, really short answers or anything like that. So I felt okay with it, even though I try to always be, respectful of people's time and not go over. But the thing is, then, we stopped the recording and then we talked for like 20 minutes afterwards. So clearly he would have been fine if we had, continued going on. And so I'm wondering, Johnny, and I had, other questions to ask him. I'm wondering how you would have handled that or how you do handle that. Because, my idea on that is, if I could go do that again, would be to, find a way to ask the guest if they're cool going a little bit longer, even if you have to stop the recording. Because what I don't want to do is be like, hey, we're at 30 minutes. Hey, are you good for like 10 more minutes? Because if you're recording that and they think the audience is going to hear that, they may not want to be rude and be like, no, I've got to go. Some would, but you may almost bully them into 10 extra minutes that way, which I don't want, but I'm wondering if you could, if there's a way, maybe stop the recording. Hey, Robert, I've got a couple more questions to ask. Are you good for 10 minutes or do we need to stop it right there? Maybe see what he said and then perhaps start the recording again, or if you have stopped it and that, the post-show conversation is really rolling, maybe interject and say, hey, can we roll on this? Maybe ask you that question again and let's roll on this. But I would be clear that you're asking that because I thought, crap, I should just hit record again. But if someone thinks the recording is over, now they might be a little bit more relaxed. So you can't just start recording again because they may be saying things that they don't want on the air. So it's kind of a delicate situation. I'm curious how you handle it, because it's kind of my one regret walking out of it is I feel like we could have gotten like 10 or 15 really good extra minutes. But I set that expectation for 30 minutes at the beginning, and I wanted to be respectful of it. So what do you do? How would you have handled that?
So my mantra with this, with podcast episodes, with intros, with music, with anything, is leave them wanting more. That's the guest and that's the audience. Don't leave them unsatisfied, but leave them wanting more. Your regret, to me, is it's there and we can't do anything about it, but it's almost irrelevant because you were so impressed with this conversation that we're doing an episode about it today. Like, if you would have maybe done that and it slipped just from that sort of high point at the end down, we might not be talking about this because it would have just been a little bit too long and you couldn't have kept him and yourself as engaged just that extra little bit. So it has to be as long as it has to be. But at the same time, I do like to cut it off where it's just really good, but it's been really good for a while, and people are getting stuff. And your listeners are like, "Oh man, that would have been cool if that went on for another hour." If it actually did,
Yeah.
it wouldn't have been good. But they're doing that, and then they're so excited when your next interview comes out. But it's not just like, "Oh man, it didn't get into anything." Like literally, that was 8 minutes long, and we didn't get into anything. So they got a satisfaction. They got what they came for, but you didn't allow it to drop off. So always leave your audience and your guest wanting more. They want to be excited. They want to text you and tell you how awesome that was, like your guy did. It's like he might have, if that would have went 10 minutes, that might not have happened. All of those things, right?
Yeah.
And so funny thing, yesterday with that guy with zines that I've been obviously known about for 22 years, our interview actually went to about 48 minutes because I thought it was going well. And then all last night I was thinking about it. I was having this sort of regret, and I'm cutting out the last 10 minutes.
Oh,
I
wow.
think it was indulgent. And we did have fun, and he's emailed me today about it and blah, blah, blah. But I think it was more for our benefit than it was for the audience's benefit. And I think our job is to always leave them wanting more, because that's how they'll come back the next time.
That's a great answer. I feel a lot better about it now with that answer, and I think you're absolutely right. It's good stuff. Good stuff. All right, so in review for this episode, again, the big idea here is how to craft thoughtful interview questions. The first tip was about doing your homework. You got to make sure that you do your homework, and because there's no substitute for that. You've got to ingest this information to be able to move on and do anything else when it comes to crafting thoughtful questions. Number two is have a defined purpose or angle or perspective going in, not an agenda, but a purpose, a perspective of understanding who is this interview for, what do you want them to get out of it, understanding where your audience is coming to the conversation from, going through the process of thinking about all the things that may seem interesting to know, and then paring that down with an understanding of what the unique insight is that the guest can provide so that you can properly prioritize what you're going to ask. And then you've got to be prepared, but be flexible. And that comes with writing out your questions, really crafting the individual questions, having an understanding of which question you want to begin with, which question you probably want to end with, and then mentally preparing yourself to be flexible as you go and not too rigid. And then, Johnny, I love the insight that you added there to the end. I think it's important to be clear with your guest about how long you plan to keep them. Use your best judgment from there, and then don't have regrets if you end on a high point, because that's probably where it was supposed to end in the first place. So I like it. Any final thoughts on interviews before we wrap up this week, Johnny?
No, I think we've covered it. We've covered it in the past. We're going to cover it more in sort of different ways of it, but I think this sort of wraps it up well with people. And our job as showrunners is to leave you, our listener and audience, wanting more. So let's do that.
And if you do want more, obviously come back next week. Listen to next week's episode of The Showrunner. We now have 111 episodes prior to this one in the archive. So please make use of that, especially if there's, a specific topic about, creating podcast episodes, running a show that you want to learn about. We've probably covered it already. And more than anything, go to showrunner.fm. You're going to be able to get on our email list. You'll be able to get our ebook, what is it? The
guide to remarkable podcast, creating and launching a remarkable podcast.
Yes, creating and launching a remarkable podcast, and then we're going to be kicking our newsletter off again soon. So get ready for that. We got a lot of fun things coming. We are excited, and we will talk to you next week here on another brand new episode of The Showrunner.
Take care.
Beautiful.
Yeah, man. That was fun.
All right. That was fun.
45 minutes, 44
minutes.
minutes.
That was good.
So I think my mic was just way too hot.
Was it?
Yeah, because I turned it down after a minute or two, and it doesn't seem to be picking you up. But there would be a loud, and then it goes quiet for the whole rest of the.
That makes sense. Let's find a time to chat either tomorrow or Friday. Let's get our content strategy rolling.
Okay. What's better for you?
It's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, Friday is not good. So tomorrow. if you have any time tomorrow. And if not, we can do it beginning of next week.
What does my next week look like? Let me just see what next week looks like. Tomorrow's pretty busy.
I guess I can stop the live YouTube broadcast now. Can't imagine people want to see us staring at our calendars.
No.
See everybody.
What about like